thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this morning. So I'm going to talk about a study where we investigated the hydration status and nutritional knowledge of athletes. So dehydration can significantly impair both physical and mental performance. So it can have a significant effect on physical performance. And this is particularly evident when dehydration occurs to an extent where there is a loss of body mass greater than 2%, and particularly when exercise goes on for longer than 90 minutes. Performance is impaired because of the physiological effects that dehydration has on the body that we can see listed here. And we also know that particularly in athletes who are very heavy sweaters and who lose a lot of sodium in their sweat, they can be particularly prone to muscle cramps when they are dehydrated. So it's very important that athletes have an adequate hydration status both before and during exercise, and they limit their body fluid losses during exercise performance. Whenever it comes to recommendations in terms of preventing dehydration, however, for athletes, it's very difficult because all athletes are different, and athletes have large variations in sweat rates, and this can be due to a number of reasons, due to genetic predispositions, also to differences in metabolic rate, the type of exercise that they perform in, and a large number of other factors. So it's not possible to give one recommendation in terms of the amount of fluid that an athlete should consume during exercise to prevent dehydration. And in their most recent position stand, the American College of Sports Medicine have recommended that athletes should try and develop customised fluid replacement programs whereby they try and prevent body weight loss to less than 2% during exercise. However, there is evidence to show that some athletes begin their training or competition in a dehydrated state. And I've just listed some studies here which have assessed the hydration status of athletes before training. And we can see here, we see even in professional athletes and elite athletes that there can be quite a high prevalence of dehydration before training. So here we see that more than 50% of players were dehydrated at the start of their training session or their competition. And this study in fact went on to show that athletes didn't consume enough fluid during their competition or training to replace that which was lost. So it's very important that athletes are aware and understand the importance of having a good hydration status before and during training. And perhaps the prevalence of dehydration before exercise is so high because athletes have a poor understanding of their fluid requirements for optimal performance. They may have a poor nutritional knowledge or a poor knowledge of fluid intake. And indeed, whenever we look at the literature, it generally shows that athletes do have a poor sports nutrition knowledge. And indeed, especially in non-elite athletes, who more than likely don't have access to sports dietitians or to sports nutritionists, they oftentimes rely on the advice of coaches. And some studies have also assessed sports nutrition knowledge among coaches, and I've just listed a few of the studies here. And again, we can see that those coaches that have an adequate knowledge of sports nutrition can be quite low. So only 35% in this study here, and only about 50 or 60% in the other two studies here. So this brings me on then to the aims of the current study, and this was to assess the hydration status of athletes both before and after training, and also to determine their sports nutrition knowledge. So we recruited a range of athletes or players from across a range of sports, and on one occasion only we assessed their hydration status both immediately before and immediately after a training session. So immediately before training, the athletes had their height, the pointer's not working, there we go. They had their height measured. They also provided a urine sample so we could look at hydration status, and we measured their weight. And then immediately following training, they were weighed again, After training, they were asked to towel off to remove any excess sweat, and they were weighed wearing the same clothes that they had been wearing when they were weighed immediately before training. They then provided a second urine sample to assess hydration status post-training, and they were then asked to complete a sports nutrition questionnaire. All of the participants provided written informed consent, and the study was approved by the University of Ulster Research Ethics Committee. So we measured hydration status by measuring urine-specific gravity, and this was done using a digital refractometer that you can see here on the slide. It's a very simple, straightforward method. It's a very practical method that can be used with athletes on the field, and basically it just measures the density of a urine sample and compares that to water. So any reading greater than 1.020 is indicative of dehydration. We also assessed the percentage body weight loss that athletes or players incurred during training. We assessed sports nutrition knowledge using a validated questionnaire that was developed by Zinn et al. In 2005. The questionnaire itself was actually developed for use in New Zealand, so we modified it slightly. We just changed a few of the brand names, for example, so they would be recognised by individuals in Ireland. The questionnaire itself comprises of 23 questions, and it is split into a number of sections that you can see listed here. Because we were looking at hydration, we were particularly interested in the fluid section of the questionnaire. And then for statistical analysis was conducted using SPSS version 21. We tested our data for normality first of all. It wasn't normally distributed, so we had to use non-parametric tests then to see if there were any significant differences. On to results then. So this table just shows the heights and weights of our athletes or players. You can see we had a total cohort number of 193 athletes or players, and they were recruited across a range of sports that you can see on the left-hand side of the table here. So we had a range of team sports such as rugby and football, hockey and Gaelic football, and then some individual sports. So we had sprinters, distance runners and karateka as well. Our sample was mostly male, 88% of our sample was male, but we did have some females there as well. Just for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Gaelic football, it's our most popular sport in Ireland, and it is very different from football. We have 15 players per team, and we're allowed to handle the ball. The ball can also be bounced to move it up the field. It can also be drop kicked as well. And points are scored by scoring a goal into the net, but also by passing the ball over the crossbar too. Okay, so our results then. So this graph shows the prevalence of dehydration before and after training. And if we look at the left-hand side of the graph, first of all, we can see that for the total cohort, there was a median prevalence of dehydration of 36%. And in particularly, the rugby and football players and the karateka athletes had the highest prevalence of dehydration. There was a significant difference across the different sports, with the distance runners and sprinters having the lowest prevalence of dehydration at the start of training. Then post-training, we see an overall prevalence of 46% of players being dehydrated at the end of training. Again, the rugby and football players and the karateka athletes had the highest prevalence of dehydration, and there was a significant difference between the groups. And what was interesting here was for the female for the female hockey players, none of who were dehydrated before training, and then there was a very high prevalence of dehydration post-training, which perhaps suggests that either they didn't have the opportunity to consume fluids during exercise, or they just weren't aware of their fluid requirements and didn't consume enough fluid during their training session. When we looked at body weight change during training, we saw a small number of players or athletes, so 4% of our cohort actually gained weight. And I should say that while dehydration can significantly impair performance, Drinking too much during exercise can also have detrimental effects, and at its most extreme it can lead to hyponatremia, where sodium levels fall dramatically and it can be fatal. It's a condition that's quite often seen in novice marathon runners who drink too much during the race, so it can have detrimental consequences as well. We observed that nearly 7% of our cohort had 2% or greater body weight loss during training. And if you remember, this is the amount that has been shown in the literature to have a significant effect on performance. So it's very likely that their performance was affected with this percentage body weight loss. About a third of our cohort also lost between 1 to 2% body weight, and there is some literature that suggests that even at 1.5% body weight loss, this can have detrimental effects. When we looked at sports nutrition knowledge then with the nutrition knowledge questionnaire, these are the scores for the different groups, and this was the total overall score, which is shown here in the graph. And overall, the median score was about 50%, so we can conclude that their sports nutrition knowledge was quite poor overall. There was again a significant difference between the groups, with our distance runners having the highest score and our karateka having the lowest score. We also looked at the score in the fluid section of the questionnaire because we were particularly interested in their knowledge of fluid intake. And again, we saw that the distance runners had the highest score, and the karateka and the female hockey players had the lowest score. And again, there was a significant difference between the groups. For the total cohort, the median score again was about 55%, again suggesting that overall fluid knowledge was quite poor for this cohort. When we split the athletes or players into those that were dehydrated according to their USG measurement or those that were euhydrated, we saw that those that were euhydrated, so that had an adequate hydration status, they tended to score higher, so they had a higher score overall, and they also had a higher score within the fluid section, which suggests that the better the nutrition knowledge or the fluid knowledge that an athlete has, the more likely they are to be in a euhydrated state. So to summarise then the key findings from the study, there was a high prevalence of dehydration among athletes and players both before and after training. About 7% of our cohort had a body weight loss greater than 2%, and thus this was likely to impair performance. Nutrition and fluid knowledge is inadequate overall, and euhydrated athletes or players had a better nutrition or fluid knowledge compared to dehydrated athletes or players. Just to flag up a number of limitations of the study, as I said, we only assessed hydration status on a single occasion, and perhaps if we had repeated this analysis over a number of days, we would have had a more accurate result. We didn't assess, we didn't take any information on which fluids or the amount of fluids that were taken in during the training session. Also, participant awareness. The athletes or the players were aware that the study was being conducted in order to assess their hydration status. And while we did advise athletes to follow their normal hydration strategies, perhaps they did deviate from that a little bit, knowing that they were going to be assessed for their hydration status. And just to note as well that the method that we used, the urine-specific gravity, it can be a little bit limited, especially if a participant has ingested a large volume of fluid immediately before analysis. And I suppose one of the gold standard methods for hydration assessment would be something like plasma osmolality. However, USG using a digital refractometer is a very practical method that's widely used within the field, and it is a recommended method for use by the National Collegiate Athletes Association. So to conclude then, it's evident from this study that athletes and players need to develop individual hydration strategies around training in order to limit body weight loss during training. So as I've said, every athlete is individual and they need to be considered on an individual basis. We also need to take into account the type of sport that they're involved in, because they may not have the opportunity for breaks within sport. So for example, the karateka that we assessed, they underwent a 1.5-hour training session without any break at all. And if we compare that to sports, if we think, for example, sports like tennis, where they get quite frequent breaks and frequent opportunities for fluid ingestion, we have to take all these factors into consideration when we are making recommendations for athletes on an individual level. It's also evident that they need to be educated in relation to their fluid requirements for optimal performance and advised on how to meet these needs. So most of our athletes were non-elite, they were mostly collegiate athletes or athletes that were participating at a club level, so they therefore wouldn't have access to a sports nutritionist or a sports dietitian. But it's important that we do try and get the message across, if that has to be via the coach or whatever, and perhaps we should be targeting the coaches as well with fluid and nutrition education. So thank you for listening. I would just like to finish up by acknowledging some of the undergraduate students that participated in this research study, and also some of my co-investigators, Dr. Alison Gallagher and Professor Jacqueline McCormick. Thank you.